I'm Elena, 33 years old, married to Marcus, my college sweetheart. We live a simple life, both working as accountants in the city. Today was one of those rare quiet days at home. No emails, no calls, just the two of us curled up on the couch with a couple of lazy sandwiches and the TV murmuring in the background. Then the doorbell rang, slicing through our quiet afternoon. Marcus gave me a surprised look, shrugged, and went to answer. My heart sank when I heard that all-too-familiar voice complaining about the stairs. Marcus reappeared in the living room with two unwelcome guests, his parents. Out of nowhere, they had decided to visit. Mrs. Harper, my mother-in-law, descended on our home like a hawk, her eyes quick to judge my casual attire. "Elena, you're lazing around in sweats? Marcus, didn't I teach you any better? This is not how we take care of our home." I felt my cheeks warm up as I stood up, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Harper. Mr. Harper, it's nice to see you." Marcus grimaced, mouthing a silent apology. I knew none was needed. It's not like he could have stopped her. Our once peaceful abode now became Mrs. Harper's stage. She sat herself down without waiting for an invitation, talking about how good it could be for them to move in. She probably loved the idea of having someone to order around full-time, and that someone was me. I wanted to protest, to stand up and say no, but I glanced at Marcus and hesitated. He was an only child, and I knew he'd feel torn. The thought of living with Mrs. Harper, though, under that constant scrutiny, it was terrifying. The visits were bad enough. They've always been too frequent and too long, filled with her snide remarks about how I kept house or my cooking. Marcus tried to make light of it, but I knew him well enough to see that he was just trying to keep the peace. He'd never dare stand up to his mother, and that left me to fend for myself. As Mrs. Harper rattled on about the potential joys of cohabitation, painting a picture of family bliss, I quietly seethed. Marcus was a good man, but when it came to his mother, he was powerless. Or maybe he just didn't want to see how much it was affecting me. I needed a plan, a way to protect the life I had built with Marcus. The idea of them living with us, of her being around all the time, was too much. I couldn't let it happen. I would not let it happen. But how? Whatever I decided, I knew I couldn't do it alone. The time had come for a serious talk with Marcus, a reality check about his parents, especially his mom, and the toll they were taking on our lives. The rest of the afternoon blurred into an anxious haze as I plotted my next move. It was a small apartment, comfortable for two, a sanctuary for our love. Mrs. Harper's grand plans threatened that peace, and I knew that something had to give. Her casual visit had sparked a silent vow within me. I would fight for our home, our life, and most of all, for my independence. This surprise attack on my quiet day was going to be the last. As the Harpers finally left, a sense of dread lingered in their wake. The stillness of the apartment now echoed with the unsaid, the tension hanging heavy. I managed a half-hearted wave goodbye, then slumped back onto the couch, drained and on edge. Marcus sat beside me, a wrinkle of concern etched across his forehead. "Elena, I'm sorry," he began, his voice low, knowing that his apology was as empty as the pit in my stomach. "They just showed up, and I didn't know how to turn them away." I looked at him, wishing I could ease his guilt, but I had my own bubbling resentment to address. "If your mom moves in—" I paused, the words "I won't stay" perched on the tip of my tongue. But I couldn't say them. Not yet. We spent the evening in a quiet standoff, the unsaid building a wall between us. I pondered how we had reached this point. There was a time when visits to the Harper household were occasional and cordial, but after the wedding, their true nature surfaced. The bonds of marriage had apparently tightened expectations, pulling me into a role that I never auditioned for, part housemaid, part trophy daughter-in-law. The next day was Sunday, typically a day we locked the world out and basked in each other's company. Yet the conversation from the day before loomed like dark clouds on a clear sky. Over breakfast, I broke the silence with a determination hard-forged from countless slights and criticisms. "Marcus, we need to talk about your parents," I said, setting my cup down with deliberate care. "Especially about your mom's idea of moving in with us." He cringed at the mention, but nodded and listened. It was one of the qualities that had drawn me to him, the willingness to listen even when the words were hard to swallow. "They are your parents, and I respect that, but the way your mom treats me, it's too much. Her surprise visit yesterday was the tipping point. I can't have that be my life, Marcus. Our life. Marcus took a deep breath, meeting my gaze. I know she can be difficult. I'm so used to her ways that I forget it's not normal. I don't want you to be unhappy, Alina. I love you. Then help me fix this. My voice cracked a little, but my resolve stood strong. Your mother can't stay here. We can't live that way. Marcus reached for my hand, his thumb brushing the back of it in a soothing motion. I'll talk to them, he said after a long pause. I'll make sure she understands that this is our home, our rules. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The first step was taken, a small victory in what I anticipated would be a lengthy battle. But that glimpse of defiance in Marcus, the subtle stiffening of his spine as he spoke, it gave me hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could stand together against the tide. With his words came the promise of support, but also the understanding of the challenge that lay ahead. Confronting Mrs. Harper would require a strength neither of us knew we possessed. The battle lines, however invisible, had been drawn. The next move was ours to make, and I could only hope it would lead us towards a future where our home was finally ours again. The days that followed were awkward and rife with tension. Mrs. Harper did not call or drop by, and I wondered if perhaps Marcus had spoken to her. But he was tight-lipped about it all, retreating into a somber shell whenever I broached the subject. While Marcus was at work one Tuesday, I stared at the walls of our small apartment, the quiet a stark contrast to the busy fury that Mrs. Harper often brought into our lives. Taking a deep breath, I made a decision, one that I hoped would bring some semblance of freedom and respect. We had to set firmer boundaries, and if Marcus couldn't do it, then it was up to me to draw the line. That evening, armed with resolve and a simmering pot of courage, I waited for Marcus to return. He trudged through the door, the weight of the day creased into his suit and the lines around his eyes. I helped him off with his jacket and led him to the couch. Marcus, we need to talk. Seriously, he nodded, running a hand through his hair. Okay, talk to me. It's your parents, Marcus, specifically your mom, I started, feeling my pulse quicken. I feel trapped. I feel like I'm constantly being judged and evaluated, like I'm not a person to her, but just an extension of you that needs to be shaped and molded. He looked pained, his eyes conflicted as they met mine. Elena, they're from a different generation. Mom, it's her way of showing care, of being involved. I told you, I've talked to her, I've asked her to dial it back. Marcus, it's not enough to ask her to dial it back. We need a clear break from this suffocating control. I need you to understand how this affects me. It's not about being involved, it's about controlling every aspect of our lives down to when I can have a peaceful day at home. The words came flooding out, propelled by pent-up emotions and sleepless nights. Marcus sat silent for a good minute, his brow furrowed. Then he slowly reached out, taking my hands in his. I don't want to lose you over this, Elena. You mean more to me than any old tradition or expectation my parents might hold. I clung to his words, a lifeline amidst the swirling current of my worries. What do we do then? How do we put an end to this? Because, Marcus, I can't go on like this. I'm reaching my breaking point. Marcus stood up, pacing the room. I think we need a more drastic change. Maybe it's time for us to find our own place. I mean, a house, somewhere your mom can't just show up. My heart skipped, even as my mind raced to keep up with the gravity of his suggestion. But we can't afford a house right now, not in the city, I interjected, the practical side of me overriding the momentary hope. We'll make it work. We'll figure it out, just like we have with everything else, Marcus said, more to himself than to me. His determination stirred something within me, an almost forgotten sense of courage and optimism. Maybe there was a way out of this after all, a way to start afresh in our own space, on our own terms. As the evening grew late with discussions and what-ifs, I realized that drawing a line with the Harpers was more than just about setting boundaries. It was about reclaiming our lives. And as unrealistic or as distant as it felt, the possibility of a new beginning filled me with a cautious hope, a hope that we could one day be truly free. The idea of moving to a new home was like a beacon, guiding me through the fog of uncertainty that had enveloped us. Every morning I woke up with renewed purpose, scrolling through listings and crunching the numbers. The thought of having a place solely ours, free of surprise visits and the looming threat of Mrs. Harper, kept me fueled. Marcus noticed the change in me, my newfound energy and focus. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" he asked one evening as he peered over my shoulder at the screen. "I've never been more serious about anything," I replied without hesitation. The light at the end of the tunnel was not just a distant dream anymore. It was something tangible, a place where we could rewrite the rules of family and togetherness. We figured out that if we were frugal, saved relentlessly, and perhaps moved a bit further from the city, we could do it. There'd be sacrifices. Longer commutes, fewer takeouts, less spontaneous weekend getaways. But the trade-off seemed more than worth it. And so began our quiet rebellion. To the world, and especially to the Harpers, our life continued unchanged. But beneath the surface, we were laying the groundwork for our escape. We would nod and smile through obligatory family dinners, all the while mentally planning our future home's layout, the garden we'd plant, and the color of the living room walls. As I went about my days, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt thinking about how I was deceiving Mrs. Harper. Regardless of everything, she was Marcus's mother. But the memories of her cutting remarks and the relentless demands quickly snuffed out any pangs of conscience. This was not just about me anymore. It was about the life Marcus and I deserved, a life we intended to build together. After several months of meticulous planning and saving, I found it, a little fixer-upper on the outskirts of town, within our modest budget. It was love at first sight, at least for me. Marcus took a little persuading, but when he saw the way my eyes lit up as I talked about transforming the rundown home into our sanctuary, he was sold. With the help of a small loan and a lot of determination, we began the process of purchasing the house. It was during this time that I started to see a change in Marcus. The house gave him something concrete to fight for, a stake in our joint defiance against his mother's dominion over our lives. He became more assertive, outlining boundaries with his parents, even within our current living space. Simple things like quiet Sundays just for us became non-negotiable. There was a newfound peace between us, a strengthening bond fortified by the shared goal. Occasionally, we'd catch each other's eye and smile, silently affirming our decision. It wasn't long before the papers were signed and the keys were in our hands. The reality of it hadn't quite sunk in yet, but as we stood on the threshold of our new home, it felt like the first breath of spring after a harsh winter. We had done it. We had started the journey to reclaim our lives. Mrs. Harper, in her oblivion, remained none the wiser about the move. To her, we were the obedient children, never stepping out of line. The idea that we had mustered the courage to leave never crossed her mind. We chose not to tell her until everything was set in stone, anticipating the inevitable storm. It was the silence before that storm that I savored most, those tranquil moments where our future was just ours, bright and filled with promise. This house, our new beginning, would be the testament to our love, one not even Mrs. Harper could meddle with. It was the stage for a lifetime of memories we would create, just Marcus and me, together. Our excitement was palpable as we stepped into our new home for the first time as owners. It needed work, but that did little to dampen our spirits. We spent evenings flipping through paint swatches and imagining where each piece of furniture would go. What once was a picture in our minds was slowly taking shape right before our eyes. Every decision we made, from choosing the bathroom tiles to deciding on the curtains, felt like a declaration of our autonomy. We were giddy with the freedom of it all, even if it meant rolling up our sleeves and staining our hands with paint and dirt. The work was hard, but it was ours, and every brushstroke felt like a small victory. There was, however, an unspoken understanding that the real test was still to come. The day we'd face Mrs. Harper and tell her we were moving out was drawing near. With each box we packed, I could feel my anxiety growing. One evening, as Marcus and I sat amidst a fort of cardboard and bubble wrap, I turned to him. "We should tell your parents about the move soon, before they visit and find the place half empty." Marcus's hands stilled from taping up a box. He took a deep breath, nodding in agreement. "You're right, we can't avoid it any longer. I'll talk to them this weekend." "Are you really ready for that conversation?" I asked, sensing the hesitancy in his voice. "No, but it's about drawing that line, right? Making sure they know this is our choice, our life, he said, a note of conviction entering his voice. So, when we tell them, will you handle it, or do you want me to be there too? I queried, preparing myself mentally for whatever role I needed to play in this pivotal moment. He paused, considering. I think we should do it together. It'll send a clearer message that we are united in this. I nodded, strengthened by his resolve. This wasn't just about moving homes, it was about setting the tone for our relationship with the Harpers here on out. Later that weekend, the air was tense with anticipation. We invited Mrs. Y. Harper and her husband over for what they thought was just a regular catch-up over tea, but we had rehearsed our lines, preparing for every possible reaction. When they arrived, the conversation started on an innocuous note: jobs, health, the usual pleasantries. Then, as the tea began to cool, Marcus cleared his throat. Mom, Dad, Elena and I have something important to discuss with you. Mrs. Harper eyed us, her intuition likely picking up on the seriousness of our demeanors. What is it, dear? We've bought a house, Marcus announced, his eyes locking with hers. It's out of town, and we'll be moving soon. Silence followed, a heavy, thick presence in the room. Mrs. Harper sat back in her chair, recovered from her initial shock, her expression unreadable. Mr. Harper, always less forthcoming with his thoughts, merely raised his eyebrows. Her lips pursed. Mrs. Harper finally spoke. A house? And when were you planning on telling us about this very mature decision? Her tone was spiked with sarcasm, but her usual biting remark was absent, replaced by something that sounded almost like grudging respect. We wanted you to be the first to know once it was certain, I chimed in, trying to bridge the sudden gap that had formed at the table. It's a new chapter for us, and we're really looking forward to it. The rest of the visit was cloaked in a strange formality. But as they left, there was no uproar, no dramatic protest, just a quiet acceptance that things between us would change. Maybe Mrs. Harper understood on some level that this was inevitable, a natural progression of our married life. As the door closed behind them, I let out the breath I'd been holding. The blueprint of our new life had been laid out, and as daunting as it was to confront Mrs. Harper, Marcus and I had done it. Together. Our foundation was solid, our walls built on love and support for one another. Whatever came next, we'd face it side by side. The house was more than a set of keys or a deed. It was our statement, our commitment to a life where our choices were just that. Ours. It represented our courage to break free from the shackles of expectation and to tread our own path. For the first time in a long while, the future was brimming with brightness, and I was eager to see where our journey would take us. The conversations with the Harpers, though subdued, hung over our heads as Marcus and I continued the laborious process of moving. We had expected theatrics, torrents of disapproval, but their subdued reaction had left us feeling strangely unsettled. It was as if we were bracing for a wave that never came crashing down. Marcus and I spent our days packing up our apartment, each box filled not only with our possessions, but also with memories. Somehow, among these cardboard containers, there was a sense of both closure and new beginnings. We acknowledged that telling the Harpers about the house was never going to be the hardest part. We were still their children, in one way or another. The true challenge was establishing our independence and making it clear that moving forward, their input in our lives would be limited to what we welcomed. We planned our move meticulously, deciding it best not to reveal our new address to Mrs. Harper, at least not yet. We knew she meant well in her own way, but we couldn't risk our newfound autonomy. The moving day came faster than expected, and we found ourselves standing in an empty apartment, echoes of the past bouncing off the bare walls. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I replied, fighting the swell of emotions. It was the end of an era, and the magnitude of the moment wasn't lost on us. We made our way to our new home, heartbeats keeping time with the rhythm of the road. Arriving at the house, we were greeted by the chaotic melody of moving, boxes being shuffled, furniture being arranged, and voices giving directions. In the midst of it all, I realized this was the first time in years I felt truly alive. Later that afternoon, as the movers took their leave and the dust settled, we sat on the porch steps, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the place we now called home. It felt right, like every decision we ever questioned led us perfectly here. We'd barely begun to enjoy the quiet when a car pulled up the driveway. Unexpected, unannounced. It was the Harpers. My heart sank, and I glanced at Marcus, who wore a similar expression of dismay. "How did they find us?" I whispered as Mrs. Harper, followed by her husband, strode toward us with her usual determination. "Elena, Marcus, quite the hideaway you've found yourselves," Mrs. Harper began, her eyes scanning the property. "You really should have told us about the moving day. We would have loved to help." Marcus stood, positioning himself between me and his mother, a silent signal of protection. "Mom, we wanted to do this on our own. It's important to us." However, Mrs. Harper seemed unfazed by our attempts to assert our boundaries, and it quickly became apparent why they were there. "Your home is quite spacious. Surely you wouldn't mind if we stayed for a while." "A fresh change of scenery would do your father and me good," she stated, a glint of triumph shining in her eyes. An icy wave of indignation washed over me, but it was Marcus's response that surprised me most. "No, Mom," he said firmly, his voice steady and confident. "Elena and I need this space to ourselves. This is our time." Mrs. Harper's smile faltered, a crack in her composure that I had never seen before. Mr. Harper placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. The conversation that ensued tested our resolve as Mrs. Harper pushed, cajoled, and attempted to guilt us into submission. Yet, despite the emotional tumult, Marcus and I found strength in our shared resolve. Eventually, with a resigned huff, Mrs. Harper conceded, leaving us in the quiet of our victory. Amid the twilight hush, Marcus wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into his embrace. For the first time in a long while, the future felt like a canvas we could color with our own aspirations. Turning the tables on the expectations and constraints had not been easy, and as twilight wrapped around us, I knew there'd be more challenges. But in that moment, the house stood not just as a structure of wood and stone, but as a testament to our determination to live life on our own terms. From the porch of our new home, with the Harper's car disappearing into the twilight, the world felt expansive and filled with possibility. We had taken the leap, weathered the confrontation, and now we faced a horizon that was wholly ours. There, in the quiet after the Harper's retreat, we began to dream of all the tomorrows we would build in the sanctuary we had fought so hard for. In the wake of the Harper's visit, Marcus and I spent the evening unpacking and arranging our new home, a tangible reminder of the independence we had fought so hard to achieve. Our efforts throughout the day had been fueled by an adrenaline born of both excitement and the confrontation with his parents. Now, as night descended, we moved slower, fatigue making our movements languid. Despite the physical weariness, there was a lightness to our spirits, a shared sense of accomplishment that seemed to fill the empty spaces of our still half-furnished house. We exchanged tired but genuine smiles as we realized the Harpers' unexpected visit had been a final test, one we had passed together. Marcus plopped down on the couch amongst a sea of packing paper. "I can't believe we did it. They left, Elena." "Mom actually left," I chuckled, settling down beside him. "We did, didn't we? Stood our ground and protected our peace." The following morning brought with it the sounds of a new beginning, the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in our backyard. Over coffee, Marcus and I discussed what the future could hold. A garden here, a fresh coat of paint there. With each idea, the house felt more like a home, our safe haven. We weren't naive enough to think that this would be the last of the challenges with the Harpers, but we had proven to ourselves that we had the strength to face them together. It was a partnership solidified not just by love, but by mutual respect and the fierce defense of our shared values. Weeks slipped past, the crisp edges of our resolve softening into the comfortable rhythms of our daily lives. The Harpers remained a distant thought, their presence more like the echo of a heavy door slamming shut, signaling our release. We occasionally heard from them, but the calls were brief, the tones civil. Something had shifted, a veil had been lifted. One evening, as the scent of a home-cooked meal filled our kitchen, the phone rang. Marcus glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It was his mother. Taking a deep breath, he answered. I watched, ready to support him through whatever demand or criticism might come. But as the conversation unfolded, his expression softened. I could only catch one side of the exchange, though it became clear that the discussion was not about intruding or overstepping. When Marcus hung up, he looked over at me, his eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions. That was Mom. She sounded different. Reflective, even. And, I prompted, wary of getting my hopes up. She apologized, Elena. She said she's been thinking about everything, about how she's acted, and she's sorry. She wants to try to understand us, to have a relationship that respects our boundaries. It was a lot to process, a turn of events I hadn't anticipated. Marcus approached, taking my hands in his. I know we've been through a lot because of her, but maybe this is a chance for something new, something healthier. It was a possibility that felt both fragile and promising. We agreed to take it slow, to see if Mrs. Harper's change of heart was new. Deep down, I hoped for reconciliation, not just for our sake, but for the joy it could bring Marcus. Our house had become a symbol of our self-determination, a fort protecting us from external forces. But it was also becoming a place of healing, a space where broken ties could be carefully knotted back together. The true test of our new life wouldn't be in keeping people out. It would be in learning which ones we could cautiously let back in. In the weeks that followed, the tentative olive branch extended by Mrs. Harper gradually began to take root. The calls between Marcus and his parents became more frequent, their subject matter progressively lighter and tinged with a genuine desire to understand our boundaries. As for me, I watched this transformation from a careful distance, a spectator to the quiet mending of a once fractured family bond. It was a healing I hadn't dared hope for, and yet there it was, unfolding before me with each shared laugh and tender compromise. One sunny Saturday morning, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his cell phone pressed to his ear, the sunbeams weaving golden streaks across his face. The laughter I heard from his end of the call filled the room with a kind of warmth that no ray of sunlight could match. When he ended the call, he turned to me, his eyes alight with a happiness I hadn't seen in such a long time. "The folks want to plan a visit," he said, the word folks feeling less like a title and more like an endearment. "But this time they're asking when would be convenient for us." "That's definitely a change," I replied, the corners of my mouth curving into an optimistic smile. In the midst of planning for the Harpers' first post-reconciliation visit, our life in the new house settled into a comfortable routine, each day weaving itself seamlessly into the next. We had begun making memories in every corner of our home, the good and the bad, the mundane and the sublime, all decorating the canvas of our shared existence. And then as autumn whispered its approach with cool breezes and the crinkling of leaves, we were presented with a surprise that would alter the course of our lives forever. Marcus, coming home with an aura of secrecy, held behind his back a small white envelope, the edges slightly crumpled from his nervous grip. "I picked up the mail today," he said, a quiver of excitement in his voice. Handing me the envelope, he watched my every movement as I tore it open. My eyes scanned the contents, the words blurring and refocusing as the meaning behind them dawned on me. It was a letter, an invitation to a new adventure, a new life, one we had created together. I was pregnant. We were going to be parents. In that moment, our house transformed into a home in the truest sense, a shelter for our growing family. All the challenges we had faced, the battles we had fought to claim this space as ours, suddenly seemed small in the face of this new, profound purpose. The news of our impending parenthood set a whirlwind of joy into motion. Marcus swept me into his arms, and amidst our laughter and tears, we imagined the new chapter that awaited us, a chapter filled with first steps, first words, and the countless firsts we would experience together as a family. Our journey had been unpredictable, a path strewn with obstacles that, at times, seemed insurmountable. But as we looked ahead, with the promise of new life on the horizon, we knew that every step had been worth it. This house, this elegant structure of wood and paint, of dreams and determination, stood as the physical embodiment of our journey. It was the beginning of our legacy, one of love and unity, one that would now continue with the laughter and footsteps of our child. From this day on, it would be more than just a house. It would be the keeper of memories, the backdrop of our child's childhood, and the setting of our family's story. We were ready to embrace the new, to step boldly onto the brighter path that we had paved for ourselves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final golden glow over our home, I realized that it wasn't the end of our struggles, nor the end of our victories. It was simply another bend in the road, another opportunity for growth and discovery. With hearts full and hands united, we turned towards the future, towards a life of possibilities. And together, with love as our guide, we stepped into the luminous embrace of the days ahead.